Yoli.
Great, Sarah, I'm going to go ahead and get started. Hi everyone, this is Yoli Flores, Chief Learning Officer for the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, and we're thrilled that so many of you have joined us. I would like to start just with some housekeeping details. First of all, you'll see the chat box down below. If you hover your cursor down to the bottom of the Zoom page, or the Zoom screen, you'll see the chat box. We would love it if you would introduce yourself in the chat box. Also, all attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement by posting questions in the Q&A box. So not the chat box, but the Q&A box. Many of you know that we are archiving all of our webinars. Every webinar is being recorded. We will send you a link to that recording in the email next week to all who registered. And you will see at the end of the webinar, toward the end, that we will be posting a brief survey poll during the Q&A, and would love for you to respond. Your responses really help us plan for future webinars and make sure that we're meeting your needs. So a little bit about Grade Level Reading Learning Tuesdays. You'll see the screen there that has 3 upcoming webinars. All of the webinars, as most of you know, are on Tuesdays at 3 o'clock Eastern time. Our intention is to be predictable and reliable with our schedule so that you always know when there is a learning opportunity on behalf of the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Now, just one note about our goal and intent to be predictable. Next week, there will be one minor change in the webinar. And this is the webinar on the show and tell early childhood development innovations with our partners at Promise Venture Studios. Because of our partnership with PBS, we are using their platform. It's called the Big Marker platform instead of Zoom. So you'll find that that link can be found on our Zoom registration page, and it will also be in our weekly newsletter that goes on Fridays. We've to date hosted 17 webinars, so we now have a growing archive of recordings and resources that are available on Clip, which is our platform, and where you can find all of these great webinars. So let's get started. I'm really excited about today's conversation. What does it take to be an early learning community? So research shows how the communities in which families live affect parents and caregivers' abilities to provide their young children with the types of experiences that can support the early development. Today, we'll learn about a great set of tools that are now available to help communities become early learning communities and to do that work. So to begin the conversation, I am honored to introduce to you our panelists. You'll see on the screen that we have Cailin O'Connor, Mike English, Anna White, and Julie Holland. And let me tell you a little bit about each one of them. So Cailin O'Connor is a senior associate for the Center for the Study of Social Policy, where she supports communities in building early childhood systems that support early learning and development. Previously, Cailin served as a senior consultant at the National Alliance of Children's Trust and Prevention Funds. She was a consultant at the Wisconsin Child Abuse and Neglect Prevention Board, and as outreach specialist at the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Thank you, Cailin. Anna White is a program manager for the Early Childhood Success Team in the Institute for Youth Education and Families at the National League of Cities. Anna has over a decade of early childhood systems building experience at both the local, state, and national levels. Before joining NLC, Anna worked for the District of Columbia's Office of the State Superintendent of Education, supporting the Quality Improvement Network, which leveraged DC's Early Head Start Child Care Partnership Grant to build a neighborhood-based quality improvement system for early childhood development providers. Prior to that, Anna served as the Director of State Affairs for the National Head Start Association and worked for several years in the Alaska State Department of Education's Head Start Collaboration Office and the Alaska State Legislature. Mike English serves as the Executive Director of Turn the Page KC. As the organization's first Executive Director, Mike established Turn the Page KC as a 501c3 nonprofit organization and has since led the creation and implementation of the organization's strategic plan. Turn the Page KC mobilizes the Kansas City community to help increase the number of children that read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. Mike has worked in leadership positions at different nonprofit organizations for 20 years. Mike earned his undergraduate degree in philosophy from the University of Notre Dame and his master's degree in public policy studies from the University of Chicago, focusing his studies on public finance. And last but not least is Julie Holland. Julie leads the Parent Leadership Training Institute in Kansas City, an initiative that supports a healthy democracy by training parents to become leading advocates for their children. Previously, Julie served as education advisor to former Kansas City Mayor Sly James, where she authored and spearheaded the development of over 15 plans, federal applications, and community reports that propelled initiatives with new funding or new strategy, including the People Plan, a $30 million grant for a HUD choice neighborhood, and a $300 million tax plan to expand access to affordable, high-quality pre-K. Julie earned her bachelor's from the Oklahoma State University, master's from Syracuse University, and a doctorate in law and policy from Northwestern University. She also worked at the UN Marion Kaufman School, the UN Marion Kaufman Foundation, the Make-A-Wish Foundation of Central New York, and congressional offices in Oklahoma and Washington, D.C. So we've got a rock star panel. I have to warn you that 2 of them may brag a little bit about Sunday's football game. Congratulations to the Chiefs. And we'll give them a moment to boast when they come on. So thank you to the 4 of you for being part of this conversation. We've been eager and excited to learn about the work of early learning communities and the digital tools and the many other resources that you'll be making available to communities. So I want to start actually with Anna and Cailin to set the context for today's conversation. Tell us a little bit about your respective organizations, CSSP and NLC, the National League of Cities, and how you became engaged and been working together as part of this Early Learning Nation collaboration. So we'll start with you, Cailin, and then we'll hand it over to Anna.
Great, thank you, Yoli. So I'm from the Center for the Study of Social Policy, or CSSP, where we are very lucky to have Yoli on our board, I have to mention. And we are a national nonprofit that works to achieve a racially, economically, and socially just society where children and families can thrive. I particularly work in our young children and their families team, focusing on the early childhood and particularly on the role of families when their children are young. So we were very excited to have this opportunity with funding from the Bezos Family Foundation to work along with the National League of Cities on developing concepts and materials about what it means to be an early learning community, with the idea that a bunch of early learning communities form together to create an early learning nation. And so I know my colleague Anna will introduce herself and National League of Cities. We are not able to hear Anna.
Anna, are you on mute?
Yeah.
There, we can hear you now.
Oh, wonderful.
You can hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay, perfect. I apologize for that. So the National League of Cities, we are a membership organization. We've been around since 1924. We work with city leaders across the country. I work in a special institute within our organization. We're a nonprofit called our Institute for Youth Education and Families, where we help drive better outcomes for young children and their families. I specifically work on early childhood, birth through age 5. And then, so we got started as this collaboration, as I think Cailin mentioned, back in 2014. There was a U.S. Conference of Mayors resolution designating the years 2015 to 2025 as an era of community focus and building an early learning nation. And so this came out of all of the research around the brain science and the economic return on investment. And so we at the National League of Cities and our partners over at the Center for the Study of Social Policy really sort of heeded that call and worked together to come up with a framework and some materials to support communities and helping them become an early learning community.
Great, thank you, Anna. Anna, tell us a little bit about what that means. What an early learning community is. What are the building blocks that we could see in an early learning community? Help us sort of understand the work that you've been collaborating on.
Great, thanks, Yoli. Yeah, so I mean, originally it really started with coming up what are sort of that North Star vision for ensuring that all young children can thrive. And so we came up with sort of 3 goals that we're really trying to help impart with our city and community leaders. One, that pregnant women and young children are healthy, that children are ready to succeed in school, and that children live in safe, stable, nurturing families and communities. And so when it came to really realizing those goals, we came up with a framework called our Building Blocks for Success, which is centered around 4 key pillars that you can see here. One is community leadership, commitment, and public will, quality services that work for all young children and families, neighborhoods where families can thrive, and that policies that are supportive and responsive to families. And so within the context of all 4 of those pillars, there's a focus on equity, family partnerships, and use of data. And so with the help of the EC Link communities and within NLC, our original cohort of 7 cities, we really took to them this building blocks framework and helped sort of come up with a guide to really what does that look like in communities, in cities. And so that's where the Early Learning Community Action Guide was really formed. And so it's broken down into sort of 4 key pillars and some strategies and levels. So no matter where you are within your community, whether you're just getting started or whether you're far along, there's an opportunity to make progress within each one of those 4 building blocks. And so if we start with building block 1, that's kind of really where the heart of this work really starts, and sort of that community leadership, commitment, and public will, and how do you make early childhood a priority. We find that cities and communities, that's where they start, and really thinking about what is it that we can do as a community to really prioritize this. So it's building partnerships. So local leaders are working together across systems with a focus on early childhood. It's really thinking about, how does the community invest in young children and families? So not just thinking about hard money dollars that the city is investing, but how are you working together and coordinating resources in a way that you can more effectively and efficiently serve young children and families? And that community members support and understand the importance of early childhood health and well-being. A rich network of informal supports is available for all families, and that community resources for children and families are well known, accessible, and easy to use. So within each one of the building blocks, there are a set of targets that correspond with, so what do we want to see within a community if that building block is in place? And then the different levels are associated with different actions that a community can take to whether they're just getting started or whether they're far along. If we want to move to the next slide on building block 2, we can kind of talk a little bit more about what that looks like. So in addition, once you have all of that partnerships and governance structure, another core component, and a lot of times what we think about when we think about early childhood systems building work is the services themselves available for young children and families. And so that's where we get to building block 2, that quality services that work for all young children and families. And so that one, we have families have access to high quality basic services that proactively promote and support health, learning, and family strengths. We have all children receive routine screening, identification, and referral and linkages for risks and needs. And that children who have been identified those risks at risk have timely access to more intensive services. One of the key pieces that we see within all of this framework, families and parents are actively engaged as partners. That supports are in place for service providers, so we're not just thinking about the services themselves, but we know one of the key factors to drive high quality outcomes for young children and families is the care that they're receiving, and so thinking about the workforce as a key component for any sort of early childhood systems building. And then 2.6, which is really also incredibly important when we think about how do we use data to really drive change and have a better understanding of where you're currently at. So target 2.6 is really leaders are using data to drive change. If we want to move on to the next slide where we talk about the third building block, we know that children exist within communities, and so the social determinants of health are incredibly important. Children don't just live within the context of their own families, but within the broader neighborhood with which they live. And so building block 3 is really focused on, neighborhoods where families can thrive. And so, does the built environment promote safety and allow families to access basic services in their neighborhood? Are there economic opportunities available for all? And then the third target is, a little more esoteric, but something that, you kind of feel when you go into a community or a city. I think CSSP and MLC, we do a lot of traveling across the country. And so, residents feel a sense of hope and belonging within their neighborhoods and a connection to the broader community. And so are there things that, a city or a community can do to help foster that? And then the fourth building block is really looking at sort of the policies, are they supportive and responsive to families? So it's really thinking about how does the city or community take into account the needs of families and young children when they're designing policies and practices. So are they equitable? Are they responsive to families? Target 4.2, that's really looking at sort of the workplace policies and are they supportive for families and raising young children. So not just what the city does, but also the broader industry. How can we help support workplace to implement family-friendly policies? And then target 4.3, that's really looking at land use and community development policies. Are they designed with consideration for how they affect young children and families? And so that's kind of the framework. Within, like I mentioned, each one of those targets, there are different levels and actions. And the exciting thing is that we've taken this action guide and made it available as an online resource. And so in the back of the action guide, there's a progress rating tool, which allows communities to sort of see where they are and rate themselves according to each one of those levels, and then kind of see what are some potential next actions that they can take. And so that part has been made available into an online version that's accessible to everyone. So I'll turn it over to Cailin now to kind of talk about the next steps with that.
Yeah, let me just jump in for a second, and I am about to post the link so that you all have the video that Anna just talked about, and Cailin will as well. But Cailin, so now that we've got a sense of the building blocks that Anna walked us through, and some of them may be familiar to many of us, others may be new ideas or ways to consider our work as we're building the infrastructure in our communities to serve young children and their families. I know you've spent a lot of time, because I've been tracking and waiting for it, but you've spent a lot of time being really thoughtful about the tools that you can provide communities to become an early learning community. So I'm wondering if you would walk us through those tools and ways in which they build on the building blocks.
Absolutely, thank you. So let's go to the next slide. This shows what we call the Early Learning Community Roadmap. And you can't read the words there, but it shows this idea, and actually what you'll see, the imagery on this infographic in front of you is similar to the video that Yoli referenced, which is this idea that all early learning communities have some elements in common, those building blocks that Anna described, but they might be put together in different ways in different communities based on your context and your needs. And so we liken that to building a playground, where every playground probably has a slide and some swings and things you can climb on, but those are arranged differently and look differently depending on a lot of different factors in your community and just the variety that people enjoy to find, that not everything needs to be exactly the same, but we do have common elements. So the Early Learning Community Roadmap walks through these 6 steps, and we have tools that support you to go through this process with these steps. The first is to assemble stakeholders, which, as Anna pointed out, the very first building block, the first target within the first building block is also about that people are coming together in your community to focus on early childhood. Some communities have long-standing groups that have been doing this. Many of you, if you're a grade level reading community, you do have some folks who are already coming together and thinking about these topics. So launching this work can be an opportunity to really assess whether the right people are at the table, whether you need to broaden your membership, diversify your membership, think about who is there, whose perspectives are represented, and hopefully start to put some funding and staffing into that. So the second point is to designate a point person for the work. We all have been part of committees that meet and enjoy seeing each other and sharing the great work, and then going back to each do their own projects, and then you meet again and just keep enjoying that you're meeting and sharing your individual work, but really trying to have a point person who can be the one to say, we've got an agenda, we've got some joint things we're working on, I'm going to check in between meetings, make sure everybody's on board, keep track of who's here, and all of that kind of thing. That having a person who's, even if they might not be high ranking in the city or in another organization structure, but they are the point person to keep the work moving. The third step then is to assess your community's progress, and that's where we've developed these tools, the action guide and the action guide and progress rating tool, which now is available as a digital progress rating tool, are designed to help people understand what those building blocks are and what the targets within them are, and then to assess how close you are to meeting each of those targets currently, and identify things that you think your community could do and should do to advance your level in whichever targets or building blocks you want to aim for. So 3 is where we've got a lot of tools that I'm going to talk about in a minute, and they all feed you into developing an action plan, which is the 4th step here. Your action plan, you can determine in your community whether that's going to be a 6-month action plan or a 5-year action plan. I would recommend you have some 6-month or shorter items on it so that people don't lose interest, but you want to, make it work for the context you're in and what people's interest levels are and how challenging the things you're trying to do are. So you could have some things that are really easy, quick things that can get done, and some things that are much longer term and are going to take a lot of collaboration and fundraising and a lot of work to do. But we want you to have an action plan so that you can all see the direction you're pointing. Step 5 is to check in with parents and other important stakeholders. We want parents to be at the table throughout all of this process, but we recognize that might sometimes be just a few parents who are, being compensated in that role and sitting at the table, this leadership team group. But when you get to the level of having an action plan and wanting to implement it, you will want to have more parents who are actually the parents in the neighborhoods you're trying to serve, the parents who would be recipients of the services you're focused on or whose kids would be participating in the programs you're talking about, to make sure that this is going to work the way it's implemented and have a lot of input at that level and hopefully also before. And then the final step on the roadmap is to regularly review your process. Your progress, so that you come back to it later and say, have we improved in these levels? Have we knocked some things off our action plan? Are there things we're still working on, but want to put more oomph into? All these different things that you might consider, that it's not just a one-time, we made a plan and and we did some of it, but rather that we're checking back in and updating our plan. I did see someone, I just popped up the question of whether we can get the roadmap in a more readable format. Yes, there's actually a link on a later slide to our website at CSSP, but you could actually just go to cssp.org and search for Early Learning Nation, and you will find a page that has a link to this infographic. I know other questions have come in. I'm not going to respond to everything because I couldn't read them all as they came in, but I did see that one. So let's go on to the next slide. A little bit about this digital tool. So this, the link to the video that Yoli posted and was also in your confirmation email. So hopefully some of you have already watched this video, but if not, I really recommend you check it out. It's 2 minutes long. It explains sort of what this process is and gives you a glimpse into what the digital tool looks like. And if you are considering doing this work in your community, I think that this video is a really powerful way to share that and let people know what you're thinking about, have them start to think about whether this would work for your community. So I recommend you go find that and use it. It's the top item at the website earlylearningnation.com, and Yoli put the link in the chat box as well. So let's go to the next slide. Also from earlylearningnation.com, you can jump right into the digital progress rating tool, which is a sort of immersive experience for you as a community lead or for a stakeholder in your community to go through and answer basically a survey about each of the building blocks that asks about how your community is doing. And it again is designed to feed into an action plan. So I'm going to show you some screenshots from the tool and hope that some of you will go ahead and start using it, or at least start the conversation in your communities about using it. So let's go to the next slide where we show what it looks like when you log in. You'll see here, my name is Cailin Stakeholder, because I have 2 accounts, one where I'm not a stakeholder, I'm a community lead. But if I go in as a stakeholder, which would be the general user in your community, you go in and you see these 4 different building blocks and you can select on a survey for one of them. Now we'll go to the next slide. Within the survey, you get a series of questions about asking you to rate your community's progress in really specific small things that you could be doing or might not be doing at all. So for example, the question that's here now is about providing coaching or mentoring to support providers in managing challenging behaviors and implementing effective practices in your programs. So I'm a stakeholder who's saying, I don't think that's happening in my community. We're not even started on that. I could also rate it that we're making progress or that we're doing well, or those in-between ones where you're not quite, you know, you can't commit fully to one or the other, but you can pick the one in between. So then what you see, if we go to the next slide, I can then pull that, I can go to my survey results and see that the, select an item for that question that I said we hadn't gotten started yet. I can select an action plan that would address that, an action step, I'm sorry. So as a stakeholder, I can put as many things as I want onto what's called an advocacy plan that I can then share with others in my community and advocate for these items to be on our community level action plan. So here, the action step is to make infant mental health consultation available. And I was able to set a due date and a budget and a progress indicator for how I will know that we're making progress on that. So what I'm imagining here is a community that would say, all right, we're gonna get some infant mental health consultation going on in our community. So I will know that we're making progress if we've done some research on the job description for a typical infant mental health consultant, created that job description and contracted with or hired a part-time infant mental health consultant by September 1st. I've attached a budget there. And if we go to the next screen, I think you'll be able to see a little more detail where I went to print out my action plan. And it shows the responsible entity would be the professional development committee, and the child care resource and referral would be the one to hire or contract with that consultant. That we do have some existing local resources in the city budget, but we'll need to be fundraising for longer term funding of this. So as you can see, it's really designed to make your action items actionable using that SMART formula, but really, you know, giving something a deadline and a budget and who's responsible for this. so that it's not just a wish list of things that you would like to do, but really getting concrete. So what happens in the digital tool is that a number of people who are stakeholders can go through and fill this out, give their ratings, select things to be on their action plan. One person in the community can be in a role called community lead, who is then able to see other people's ratings. And you can all get together and look at what you all thought should go into an action plan and work together to prioritize items and figure out where there's momentum and energy and resources to implement things. So let's go to the next slide. And just wanted to say that we do have a number of communities that are already doing this. We're going to talk about that in a moment. And I'm happy to answer questions about, how that all works, but we've got plenty of time for questions at the end. So I think we will forge onward here.
Yep. And actually good reminder for me to remind everyone that if you have a question, we are setting aside the 30 minutes after the presentation for all Q&A, so we have plenty of time. Make sure your questions are in the Q&A portion of your toolbar at the bottom of the Zoom screen rather than the chat. I know in the past we've used the chat, but we've just moved from Zoom meetings to Zoom webinars, and so we're getting a little bit more sophisticated, and it helps us track the questions much easier. So yes, Cailin, I'm sure you're gonna have a million questions. So thank you for walking us through the tools. One of the things that I've learned, and this is really a question for both you and Anna at the National League of Cities, is that the tools have evolved over time, and that you have evolved these tools in conversations that you've had with communities as they have used the tools themselves. So I'm wondering, what have you learned? What did you learn from these communities as you were road testing your tools? What kind of input and feedback did they give you? And what then materialized based on that kind of feedback that you might have thought was a good idea, maybe not after all, or things you hadn't thought of? I really am interested in how do you use the feedback from communities, and if you could share that.
Sure, so I'll start and then Anna will chime in as well. The first thing I want to say is that we worked with communities from the very beginning of this process. So we have a network that's convened by CSSP called EC Link. You can see the logo there on your screen. EC Link stands for Early Childhood Learning and Innovation Network of Communities. And these are communities that are doing really strong local early childhood system building already. And we worked with them to define what it means to be an early learning community. They really articulated those building blocks, and it took a while before we started calling them that and knew exactly how to group them and how to name them, but they helped us identify all those targets within the building blocks and said what was really important to them as they thought about what made their community a place where families would want to move to raise their children, right? What makes it a community of choice that people intentionally want to go to. So we developed those building blocks, and then from that we expanded it to the action guide. And with that, we had communities that from our EC Link network and from the cohort of cities that National League of Cities had convened by then, who helped to suggest the action steps that would make sense with each of these targets and levels, reviewed the drafts. We had 4 communities that held focus groups of parents to review the guide. And particularly, we highlighted every point in the guide where we said to convene parents or check with parents on this or that. And we wanted their feedback at least on those parts, but they tended to also respond to the rest of the guide because once they saw it, they were really excited about what it would mean to live in a community that was really doing all of this. So communities were integral to developing this to start with. And then I think Anna's going to talk about the pilot that we did.
Thanks, Cailin. Yeah. So one thing we mentioned, the communities were always involved in this process from the formulation of the framework through the action guide, and now we continue to work with communities as they're using the online tool. So we started with a cohort of 7 cities that included Kansas City as well, who will be on kind of share their experience as well. But we worked also with Dayton, Ohio, with Jacksonville, Florida, Minneapolis, Pittsburgh, Portland, Maine, and San Francisco, California. And a big part of that was really kind of helping them develop helping us develop the framework and those actions. So all the actions that are included in the Early Learning Community Action Guide are really taken from real-world examples. But we also really worked with them to help us pilot the progress rating tool. Is this something that actually makes sense in communities? Is this something that you can do with stakeholders? As you're completing it, does it align with really kind of the levels that are included in the action guide? So, are the actions something for a community that's just getting started? Are the actions relevant for a community that has made significant headway? So in our cohort, just like within our EC Link communities, these are cities that have a long history of doing early childhood systems building work and could really provide that feedback. And now we're kind of taking that as we move into this next iteration of the online tool. We're working with 14 cities. We're doing sort of in-depth TA with a cohort of 8 cities as they're going through the full theory of change. I know Cailin outlined the steps in building your early learning community, but they've gone through the progress rating tool and pretty soon are going to get ready to complete step 7 and sort of reassessing their progress. And then we're also working with 6 really small, really rural communities in Nebraska to help us make sense of the action guide. Is this going to translate well to smaller, more rural communities? So, for example, we have one community in Nebraska that's about 1,000. I think it's slightly under 1,000 population-wise. And so we're constantly using the work that we do in communities to help us refine further what this guide is supposed to look like and how it can be a useful tool for communities of all sizes and all across the country.
That's great. Thank you both, Anna and Cailin. I think communities that are on the webinar now really appreciate how intently and committed you are to listening to the needs of communities and to really hearing what was important for them, what they need in order to be successful in their work at the local level. So we're going to now talk to a community that was in one of your cohorts as you were pilot testing and developing the tools and the many resources that are accompanying the action guide. So let me turn it over to Mike and Julie. And if, by the way, if you were one of the people in the country that didn't know that the Kansas City Chiefs won the Super Bowl game on Sunday, you now know. And I want to just congratulate your community again, Julie and Mike, and feel free to boast, you deserve it. And then after you do that, let's hear you both talk about Kansas City's work in becoming an early learning community, talk about what that meant, share the background of the work that you and others have been doing, not only with this learning action guide, but how you really have integrated it into your work as a community, part of the network of the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. So I'll turn it over to both you and Mike, you and Julie, and we'll start with you, Mike.
Okay, well, thanks, Joey. And I won't brag too much about the Chiefs, but I will say that after they won, you might have seen that Donald Trump tweeted out a congratulations to the great state of Kansas. And I can tell you nothing makes people from Kansas City, Missouri more angry than when people assume that Kansas City is in Kansas. So I'll just start by providing a little bit of context, and that is that Julie and I both work representing kids and families in Kansas City, Missouri, which is a geographically pretty large city, which includes parts of about 15 different school districts. And so our goal at Turn the Page KC, like many of you in the grade level reading community, is to increase the percentage of kids that read proficiently by the end of 3rd grade. And because that's our mission, we have been part of this campaign, I guess, since about 2012. And so we have really stuck to the 3 pillars recommended by the campaign, which are school readiness, school attendance, and summer learning. And so our organization came out of, was really founded by our former mayor, Sly James, and he was elected back in 2011 and really wanted to do something to improve 3rd grade reading proficiency here in Kansas City. And he also recognized that he would only be the mayor for at most 8 years. And in fact, he was term limited last year. And so he made sure to, we spun our organization out as a nonprofit. And so we are still chipping away at the third grade reading issue. But early on, as we attacked this whole school readiness issue, it became very clear that this is a very complex and diverse group of stakeholders that includes early learning providers, childcare providers, school districts, the business community, and others. And so it's always been very challenging to assemble these stakeholders, develop an action plan that everybody buys into, and really hold each other accountable. So the organization that's not represented here on the webinar because she was not available, but a woman named Giovanna Ross works at an organization in Kansas City called the Mid-America Regional Council, which among other things is our local Head Start agency. So Giovanna and Julie Holland, who is on the webinar, have really worked closely with the National League of Cities to take the early learning community action guide and turn it into something that we can use in Kansas City. And so on this slide that you see here shows on the left-hand side that those 4 building blocks, and then on the right side how we as a community have taken that and really made it actionable for our city. So with that, I'll turn it over to Julie, and she's going to do most of the talking for us because she's been much more intimately involved with this, and she was the education advisor for Mayor Sly James, and so she had a very strong connection to the National League of Cities too. Julie?
Thank you, Mike. Yeah, so I have to admit that they did, I know everybody here and your support in, since you're a campaign for grade level reading city, how we all care about school attendance. And I'm, kind of embarrassed, but probably logistically had to happen, is that they had to cancel school tomorrow because of the massive parade that we will have for the Chiefs tomorrow. So it's interesting to know that as somebody who wants to make sure their kid is always in school is now having to have their kid out of school to celebrate the Chiefs. But it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. Maybe, hopefully not another 50 years will go by before we get win the Super Bowl again. But anyway, so it's a pleasure to be with you all. Yes, so one of the things I will say is that this tool is an amazing guide for any city to use, any municipality to use. What really helped us was give language and a framework to form our own. So while we were a pilot city for the Early Learning Action Guide, Mid-America Regional Council also was creating a strategic plan as well. So it really helped us have disciplined language, but we were still creating it on our own to have our own buy-in. And I think that's really important for communities when you bring people together. Definitely it's a great tool, but use it as a way that your community is still having its own conversations to develop its own goals. And so that's what really happened with these pillars you see here. But what I'll do is I'll just give you a couple examples that we have done since since we piloted the tool. So on the next slide, it talks about, and I think you heard Anna mention early that a lot of cities start with the first building block, and we did as well. At the time, we had a mayor who was very focused on early learning and working through third grade reading initiatives. So this was something that we really wanted to leverage and work through. And so a lot of it was things that had developed. We created within MARC. There had been a previous entity that had been going on for a very long time, and I'm sure you've had similar community organizations in your cities. That was called Partners in Quality. So it was just a great opportunity to kind of resurrect that group, have them start meeting more formally again, and continually looking to create the strategic plan and align our structures. So again, the tool gave us language to use to create our own strategic plan, which again, I would really encourage you to do. So we have done quite a bit in that area that to really, and I think it gives you the systems and the strength, the structure to then do all the other activities that are required in the tool. The next slide talks about, as you can see, we really try to hit this one out of the park with all the images you see on the screen. Again, leveraging having a mayor, having business leaders that were very keyed in on this topic. It was just, you know, I always say use windows of opportunity. If this is something in your city, go for it. And so we really wanted to use every platform, every direction we could go to really get this awareness out around the importance of early childhood education, health, and well-being. So we use the city as an asset. We use very, I would say, non-traditional communication platforms. It still gives me very much pride to see the Kansas City garbage trucks 5 years later still have Talk Play with Your Child Every Day bumper stickers on the back of them. And as well as the 10 or the 15 different playgrounds that are owned by our Parks and Rec in the city that have Talk, Read, Play, or the Talking is Teaching signs. I'm sure you all have heard about these things. It's just bringing them together and bringing awareness. The one big lesson we've learned that awareness is ongoing. You do it once, it's still not enough. So continuously having things in the pipeline to promote early learning is a real requirement to keep the awareness going. And then I would be remiss to say that, you know, now I'm working for Parent Leadership Training Institute, and I saw one of my colleagues, Donna Thompson-Bennett, is also joined here in the webinar. That was something really focused, if you're interested in doing anything around parent leadership and engagement, that is also addressed in the NLC's, or the Early Learning Action Guide tool, around making sure families and parents are active partners. And we use PLTI in Kansas City as a way to address the 2.4 target in the action guide. So I think that is all I'm going to mention, because I'm sure there's lots of questions that we want to get to. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, we have several questions. Before we get to the questions, and we're almost there, let me turn it back to Anna and Cailin. And I'm wondering if, for those people that are on the webinar who are interested in joining this growing network of early learning communities, who might they talk to? How might they inquire? What would they need to do?
So actually, if you go to, I think it's on the next slide, we have a little bit about how to get involved. And then maybe we'll go back to that previous one and share a little bit more about who else is working on this right now. So if you want to get involved, you can go to that earlylearningnation.com website and share that video with others in your community to help get them on board. You can go to the progress rating tool and dive in. You can, if you would like to be the community lead for your community, meaning that you're the person who can see everyone else's responses, you can send out links for other stakeholders to complete the surveys. You can put in an application for that. You have to say who you are and why you're the right person to be in that role. And we're trying to figure out how to make sure we don't have multiple community leads from the same place, or, you know, people that aren't in the right position to do that. But you can put in that approval and we will get back to you. And then you could get moving on inviting other stakeholders. If you just want to go into the tool and see how it works and you're not sure your community is going to do it yet, you don't need to set yourself up as a community lead to do that. You can create an account, don't request to be a community lead, and just say that you are a member of Demo Community for Kids. I'm the community lead on that stakeholder. I welcome you to my imaginary community, and you can go in and put as many ratings and action steps and, you know, just play around with how it works. And then if you decide that you do want to start this for your community, we can go through that process. So use that demo community if you just want to check it out. And we are exploring with the Campaign for Grade Level Reading the possibility of starting a community of practice among grade level reading communities. So there's a poll up on your screen right now asking about whether you'd be interested in that. Please go ahead and respond to that so that we know how much interest there is in the network. And we know that sometimes you just have too many things on your plate and it's not the right time to take something on, even if you think it's a great idea. We understand that. We won't take it personally if you're not interested, but we do want to know if there's a lot of interest in whether we could do a community of practice.
Great,
so,
thank you.
Yoli, maybe we can go back to the prior slide. And this is partly in response to, I saw some people typing questions in about the other logos that were on here. So The Strive Together logo is there because that's another national network that we've started working with on how they can support their members to use these tools and become early learning communities as well. Strive Together it's a network of partnerships around the country that are doing cradle to career collective impact work with they have varying degrees of how focused they are on early childhood, but we're working with 6 of them right now in a cohort who are going through it together. They're all focused on kindergarten readiness goals or goals closely related to kindergarten readiness. And they are using the tools, gathering their stakeholders, getting all that information. And we're excited that they will then share that with other members of the Strive network and hopefully be ambassadors for it within their network. And I know there's a lot of overlap between their network and grade level reading. So some of you might be in communities that are already participating in that way. I also wanted to mention that CSSP is also the home of the Strengthening Families Protective Factors Framework. And we have a lot of states and communities that are using Strengthening Families that have started to say, oh, this building block stuff looks like it would really help with how we're thinking about where we're reaching families with Strengthening Families. And so we have some interest from our Strengthening Families network in applying the building blocks to think about their communities more broadly. So you might hear about it from that direction as well from others in your community.
Anna, did you want to add anything to Cailin?
Yeah, and I'll just say from NLC's perspective, so we represent about 19,000 cities, towns, and villages, and so we started off with an original cohort of 7, which I mentioned before, and Kansas City was a part of. We've expanded that now to 14 cities. We have, in addition to the regional work in Nebraska, we're working with Hopewell, Virginia, Brownsville, Tennessee, Walla Walla, Washington, Sacramento, California, San Pablo, New Orleans, and Waterbury, Connecticut. But we also just launched just last month an early learning challenge to cities. So we broadened out this work of ELN to all of our members. So it's very possible that one of your city leaders, either your mayor or council member or senior city staff, is participating in the NLC Early Learning Nation Challenge to cities. So that started this past January and will be going through until June. So kind of walking people through the framework and helping them think about, how their city can start prioritizing young kids and families.
Great, thank you, Anna. I'll just say, there's a lot of work going on in a lot of communities. Cailin talked about those that are already engaged with this particular piece of work and interested in becoming an early learning community. Some are in Strive, some are in GLR, and our commitment is to really collaborate and connect with those that can bring to you, the communities, the best tools and resources. And on us is ways that we can align and connect to make it not another thing for you to do in your community, but really to integrate and connect. And this is why we're exploring the idea of a community of practice, which would be in partnership with NLC and with CSSP as you do your work around all of the pieces in the school readiness bucket. And how do we make sure that you succeed? What other tools and resources and support can we bring to you to deepen your work to get to the results that you want and that we all want for our low-income kids and families? So we're excited about the possibility, and we'll wait to hear from some of you to see what kind of interest there is. So now we have the opportunity to get to your questions that you posted on the Q&A. We have the next 30 minutes. We don't have to take up all the 30 minutes, but we would love it if you had more questions. We have the time, so please, as we're going through the ones that are already posted, and as you think of others, please go ahead and post them in the Q&A, not the chat box, but the Q&A box that's at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So I'm going to start with Barb Lito's question, because it gets right to the question about communities and tools and how to connect. So Barb says, I love the NLC early learning tools and stance on early childhood education as an infrastructure investment. I see you also have the Equitable Early Care and Education Alignment Framework. Would a community choose which tool to use, or would you recommend a community using both tools? Would you recommend one first, then tackle the other? So it's a little bit about sequencing and connecting the various tools and resources and frameworks.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there are so many frameworks out there, and we at NLC, we use all of our different frameworks within all of our TA cohort projects. So the Early Learning Community Action Guide, I think, is probably the most holistic in the sense that it encompasses everything that a city does. So, you know, use it as a way to kind of get started. And the great thing about the Action Guide is that it has the accompanying progress rating tool. So you can kind of see where you want to focus on and where your strengths are and where there are some opportunities for improvement. The alignment framework that was referenced is really an opportunity to think about going deeper within city government, sort of both horizontally within city agencies. So how do you guys maybe strengthen a little bit together? How do you connect with your, community planning? How do you bring the libraries on board? That sort of thing. But then it also has sort of alignment vertically, right? So if you're thinking about, at the city level, but we operate a lot within our county that has a lot of work around early childhood, or we want to connect better at the state level. So that's where the alignment framework comes in. We also have work around prenatal to 3 and the workforce, which we also kind of use as supplemental sort of tools and resources to support that work. But to answer your question, I think getting started with the Early Learning Community Action Guide is a great way to kind of frame the broader picture.
Great. Thank you, Anna. Cailin, do you want to add anything to that?
No, that sounded great.
Okay. I'm going to move to Allison Titcom's question. She had 3 questions. 2 are related. One is a little bit different about tribal communities. But Cailin, earlier as you were talking about the tool, you talked about an online survey. So Allison is wondering whether wondering if the online survey means that others would have access to your community's data. And then is wondering if the surveys have been translated into Spanish or any other language.
Great, I can answer both of those. So the putting information into the online survey does not give anyone access to that data except for those of us who are on the administrators of that tool. So the Bezos Family Foundation and CSSP and NLC. The foundation was very cautious about how much personal data would be collected, and which is basically none. So the only the community lead needs to provide email address and and zip code and what you call your sort of early learning initiative, and what level of community you're serving, whether it's a neighborhood, a city, a county, or a region. And then for each of the stakeholders, they enter their zip code and they check a box for which type of stakeholder they are, like a service provider, a parent, an agency director. I think there's one other category in there about some other type of community partner. So it's very little information. They have to provide an email address just so that they can use that as their login. But it doesn't collect very much, and no one else can see it outside of, the community lead can see what the stakeholders have entered connected to their community, and then we at the administrative level can see what's being entered across the board, but none of it is personally identifiable to anyone. And let me know if that answered your question. As for the translation, we have not translated the materials. If you look at the progress rating tool, there are a lot of words there. And what we're doing as at least an intermediary step, because that was coming up a fair amount about translation. The other thing that was coming up about the wordiness of the tool was, is this really accessible to parents or to some of the family child care providers who might not be really word-oriented, highly educated people. And so what we've done is develop a discussion guide to use with parents or with service providers that talks through each of the building blocks and gets their input and what they think the community should do in these areas without going into all of the detail that's in the written tool. And we are in the process of finalizing that parent guide with an immediate goal of having it translated into Spanish, because several of the communities that are using the materials right now need it in Spanish for some parent and provider groups in Spanish. There are other languages people would also like it translated into, and I'm not sure yet if we have the resources to get it into other languages right away, but that is the long-term plan, is thinking that a 3-page document to guide a discussion group is probably more accessible for, well, easier to translate without it being this huge process of every detail, but also more accessible for some of the groups that might not be bilingual or might not have high literacy in the first place. So we're hoping that that will help to fill the gap of not having the tool translated, but also open to feedback. If someone says, no, we really need the full tool in Spanish or another language, we want to hear that, and we will try to figure out resources to do it.
Thank you, Cailin. I hope that answered those questions. Allison also wondered, but there's actually, I'm going to group these. She wondered about rural communities and tribal communities. So let me add to that, because there were several other questions from people who were wondering what kinds of communities are you all working with? And you mentioned broadly, so if you could say more about whether they're rural, any tribal. Patricia Harris is wondering if anyone from a city in Georgia might be represented, and then what kinds of stakeholders are part of these local ELC groups, whether there are some that might involve museums as community resources, for example.
Cailin, do you want me to start, and then if you want to jump in?
That'd be great.
Okay, yeah, so just to give a little bit of background about the communities that MLC was working with. So when we started with the original 7, we were pretty intentional in terms of selecting communities that have been doing this work for a while, or where there's strong commitment from the mayor. This time around, we were really intentional. We have 4 smaller cities and 4 larger cities. 4 smaller to mid-sized cities, and we were trying to think about rural cities as well. That's why we have the 6 Nebraska cities. As we're expanding and thinking about the future work of ELN, we continue to think about how we can, reach more communities. So as we mentioned before, this tool is really meant to be iterative, and we really want that community feedback to be able to help inform, what this is going to look like going forward, and it's a tool that's really going to work for communities of all sizes and geographic locations. So this time around, we were really intentional with figuring out, is this going to work in rural communities, such as communities in Nebraska. We're also, at NLC, we have a number of constituency groups. So we have a small cities constituency group that we're thinking about, does this work within the communities that are a part of that? And then we're also, my background is obviously from Alaska, and we worked a lot with tribal communities, and we have a number of communities that are in Washington. And so that is potentially a direction that we can go should this work continue on and we continue with more community cohorts. And then in terms of stakeholders, we work mostly with city level officials and their senior staff. So in a lot of cases with us, we work directly with the mayor, or we work with, in Kansas City's case, the education advisor to the mayor, but then also sort of the community stakeholder partners. So, school district superintendents, community agency leads, so heads of Head Start, coalitions. We've seen in this previous cohort a lot of university participants, no museums yet, but obviously the library and the Parks and Rec department, and then of course the mayor's office generally tend to be the stakeholders who are most closely working on ELN.
Anna, Nilda Aponte is wondering on that point whether family childcare educators or family childcare providers have been engaged.
Yeah, and so that's one of the things that we're really intentional about, and that, as Cailin was mentioning, that build your early learning community pathway. So even though, that the community leads or the team tends to be more focused on the city level. We're really thinking about how are you engaging stakeholders and making sure that the right voices are at the table. And so we've been really intentional about pushing for, making sure that you have representatives from, all sectors of the early childhood continuum, so whether that's family child care or, community-based providers or the school district. So yeah, there are a number of our cities who have intentionally made outreach to family child care.
And related to that, which is a question that I think many of us have, comes from Christina Morales, is whose job is it to assemble these stakeholders? Is it the school districts, community members, school readiness councils? So what has the experience been so far in terms of kind of the lead? Is it, has it varied? And can you talk a little bit about how that has come together in some of the communities? And maybe Kansas City can jump in here as well.
Yeah, I think Kansas City is a great to jump in. But I'll say just from our experience of working with communities is that every community is very different. And I think being, respective of where you are in the process and who is already really engaged in this work. And so, thinking about, is there a coalition in play already? Is that the right person to be spearheading this work? Is the school district sort of already really focusing on early childhood? And so are they going to be the person to spearhead this work rather than just, the mayor has a whim and all of a sudden we want to do this initiative. So really being respectful for where the community is, where does this work already sit? And then thinking about how you can use this action guide and these resources as a way to kind of bring structure and formalization and bring other stakeholders on board. So that's kind of where it's come together. But I wouldn't say that there's one, organization that we've seen time and time again that has played the lead in all of these communities.
So Mike, let me turn to you. You were already an established coalition, Campaign for Grade Level Reading. And so you had already gone through a process of really building a coalition of stakeholders. How did you tap into what you already had, the structure you already had for this particular piece of work and becoming an early learning community?
Well, we were already established, but there were also other collective impact initiatives already established. And I think many communities have this situation where there may be 3 or more collective impact initiatives that all overlap. So for example, you might have a birth through kindergarten initiative, a birth through 3rd grade initiative, then there's a cradle to career initiatives. And each one of those has a sort of backbone organization that's trying to manage all of these stakeholders. And so what ends up happening is that you have many people going to multiple meetings with a lot of the same people. What this action guide really helped us to do in Kansas City was to not merge, but help to connect those multiple collective impact initiatives and put some real structure around it. And so the slide we showed earlier that showed that our community's kind of strategic plan here, that was the result of really getting the leads for these multiple initiatives together and really hammering that out. So in our case, I would say though that the mayor's office and the Mid-America Regional Council, those two organizations were best set up to convene both early childhood professionals and also civic organizations together.
I would just add something. This is Julie. I would just add about the civic. So you say the non-traditional players, having an established entity like a Turn the Page KC, so someone who's solely dedicated to this work, that back organization, or an early learning entity, and it's going to look different in every city. But I think that provides the stability and the consistency for when opportunities present themselves. So when you do have a mayor that's really interested in early childhood, or you do have the business community that wants to talk about family-friendly workplace policies, so then you can just tap into those when they come in and go, because they will come and go. So I think it is important just to have one entity that is consistent across time, but then that was really connected to the other entities. So what those are really about is accelerating the movement, right? So can you use these other actors and players to accelerate various targets you want to address on your action plan and things like that? But go with your strengths as a community, know where you really are doing well, and just keep building that area, and then start targeting the other areas when you have leadership in those places that are amenable to it.
Great, thank you, Julie.
And if I could jump in there too, I just wanted to explain that in our work through CSSP, we are working with some cities and some counties. So when you start working at the county level, it can be a little bit different because in the counties that we work with through our EC Link network, they all have a strong county element, some kind of county entity that's, in California, it's a First Five organization. In Florida, it might be a Children's Services Council. In Boston, it's a United Way. So there's a lot of different ways this works, but once you're at the county level, you have multiple mayors within the county, you have multiple entities and school districts that you could be working with. And so it adds a layer of complexity, but there are also resources you can tap at the county level. And for example, in Alameda County, California, Oakland got involved as their largest city, got involved in Early Learning Nation, and then helped them to launch a cohort with mayors from 5 smaller cities in Alameda County, convened by the First Five Alameda County, to work together to go through the process. So they're all becoming early learning communities now, and that's something you could do because they were a county with one city that was already involved, and I thought that was a cool way to take it forward. But just to introduce even more chaos into how it can get organized, it really depends
just another
on
layer, just another layer.
Yeah, just depends on who's in the lead.
Great. Yeah, it's really leveraging the energy that's already there and the people that are already connected and passionate about this. Quick thing, I would just want to make sure everybody sees the poll on the screen. Thank you for your response. So we're thrilled that almost 40% of you are interested in continuing to learn more and explore the possibility of becoming an early learning community. So we invite you to follow up with us. We sent you the links for you to do that. And we'll continue through that process to pose whether there's interest in becoming a community of practice through the Campaign for Grade Level Reading in partnership with NLC and CSSP. I think we can hide this poll because we're now putting up the final poll, which is the poll that gives us feedback about the webinar in its totality, and you letting us know whether this met your needs, and there's other ways that you can give us feedback so that we can continue to improve and to bring to you webinars that maximize your time and respect your time and your learning interests. So don't sign off without responding to the poll, please, please, please. Okay, a couple more questions that we haven't gotten to. I know there was a question about mayor, whether it was too late for a mayor to apply for the NLC Early Learning Nation Challenge. For those communities that have strong mayors passionate about this, maybe you could just say a little bit about it, and if you could just respond to the question about whether it's too late or can they still apply for that challenge.
No, it's not too late. So the webinar series goes for 6 months. We just had our first launch. We're going through each one of the building blocks, and so there's an opportunity for, if you want to go back and review the first webinar that's posted online. Our second webinar is going to be focused on building block number 2, and that's going to be on February 26th. And so I don't know if it's possible, but we're happy to send out more information on the links for where to register and sign up to take that challenge. But as always, we welcome mayors to join in and kind of learn more about the framework and how they can, apply some of these practices to the work that they're doing at the city level.
Great, thank you. And there is a mayor in Montgomery, Alabama. I want to just focus on. There was a question from an attendee that asked, what national funding can we apply for? I think that's on everybody's mind. We have a new mayor in Montgomery, Alabama, and some of us are encouraging him to establish a Cradle to Career Strive-like collective impact network. The first area of focus would be school readiness / pre-K. So there is interest in engaging a mayor in Montgomery, and the key question is, what funding might there be for us to do this work?
That's a great question. I think thinking about what funding already exists within your community, I think once you bring stakeholders on board, you'll be surprised to find out that there's already a lot of local funding. I know, for example, in a lot of our communities that have done this work, you know, I think Fort Worth is a great example of a place that have started up an early learning coalition as a result of being part of one of NLC's initiatives. And so once they created that structure, then they were able to go to local community funders to be able to get that work. In terms of national funding, you know, I wouldn't be the best person to answer that question, but I will say that, you know, once you bring folks together and start having those collective impact conversations about what organizations can bring to the table, and then also I think thinking about what are those local or regional funders who can go and support that work.
So let me ask Julie and Mike. And Julie, you've been the queen of bringing in resources from your background. What advice would you have to some of the communities about funding that might be accessible for this work?
Well, I do, knowing that it's a mayor, the mayor brings people together. That's one great asset that the mayor can do, is convene a lot of community business stakeholders, people that could be the funders in your community, to really get them around one idea. So using that, I say, the power of the pulpit to really bring the folks together around a central idea of why early learning is important, how this helps our long-term economic development of our city, really bringing in the chamber of business leaders, that will help stir some funding. That is what our mayor did in helping establish Turn the Page Kansas City. We did not go, I think the best thing is utilizing the assets you already have in your community, whether they're in-kind supports as well as funding. But certainly a mayor has that capability. It is just really starting with a small group of like-minded folks that are really influencers in your city.
Thanks, Julie. Mike, you want to add anything?
No, I don't think, I think I'll just echo what Julie said, in that once the mayor is leading the way, the funding does seem to follow, or at least it did in our case.
Mm-hmm. Great. Allison is providing or offering a follow-up question. If not national funding, how can we get comprehensive technical assistance? So this is why we're wondering and exploring whether there's an interest in a community of practice. So if there is an interest with a small, it doesn't have to be a large cohort, it could be a dozen communities, then through the Campaign for Grade Level Reading on CLIP, in partnership with CSSP and National League of Cities, we would figure out whether we can make this happen and provide that technical assistance through this community of practice that we would form. So it will, it could possibly be available if there is interest. Our step one was to ask the question, is there interest? And then we could do the follow-up to identify what we need to do to bring this kind of technical assistance and support to those communities. So let us know if there is an interest. Britt, we're getting close to the end of the questions. There's a couple more. This question comes from Bridget Huberman. Bridget is wondering how ELN cities and communities, or if there are some that are providing access to books for families to own at home, pre-birth to age 5. And then does Early Learning Nation have any early literacy, community literacy models and resources to share?
I'll jump in on that. This is Cailin. We don't specify, you know, a particular group that you should work with on that, but I think it's a great idea. And some of the resources that you might consider are Reach Out and Read, which is through pediatricians' offices. The Dolly Parton Imagination Library, I know a number of our communities are part of that. I know some communities are providing linking books as a sort of incentive for families to complete the developmental screening. Like if you do the Ages and Stages questionnaire, then you will receive a book that's developmentally appropriate for your child at this stage. And that's been in some places funded through ECCS, the Early Childhood Collaborating Systems. I'm not sure where folks have found other funding for it, but I think it's a great idea. First Book, of course, is a national organization that you can connect to to try to implement that in your community. So there are a lot of resources, and I think it is a strong strategy to use for promoting literacy and promoting that bonding that comes from reading together, particularly if you can link it to helping families also find other resources in the community.
Great, thank you. Anybody else want to add anything to that? Okay, great. Last question is back on the topic of rural. So this has come up a couple of times. There's, I think, some interest in that you're already working with some rural communities. And Patricia Harris is from Southwest Georgia. She lives in a very, very small rural town. And she's searching for the right fit to help the students and families improve their ability to learn for all children. Wonder if you could just talk about the experience of those communities that are in rural areas, the kind of feedback that you have received from them, and what this has contributed to their ongoing focus and work at their local level.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and talk about Nebraska a little bit. I think one of the things that we've noticed in especially some of our smaller towns, especially the one where it's population of less than 1,000, is that you have to be very nimble as a community and realize that the Early Learning Action Guide is very comprehensive and includes a lot of strategies and actions that, you know, larger cities have taken. But I think one of the great things about the resource is that it's the framework and being able to apply it with where you are currently within your community. And I think, you know, being able to take the lens of the building blocks and already apply it to what you're doing. And so for, you know, smaller towns, I think one of the things that we've noticed is just, you know, being able to bring those stakeholders together has been huge. One of the things that we were really excited about, can't remember, it was Wood River, Nebraska. They just used, a lot of this work is coming out of their economic development work. And so they applied for a USDA revolving loan grant program to be able to fund one of their child care centers so that they can use that continuously to support their economic development projects, of which child care is one of them. And so really just being able to start having those conversations, but then also being small and nimble enough to really be able to pursue opportunities and funding. I think that's one of the great things about, one of the great lessons that we've learned within our smaller communities. And then also to, as you're looking at the framework and the guide, just being cognizant of that, it's, you know, just a lens with which to look at your work and kind of, you know, think about that. And also think about this as an iterative process. So if you're taking the action guide and the framework, and that there are some things that really just don't work for smaller communities, that's kind of feedback that's helpful for NLC and CSSP as we continue to build out these resources and help communities of all sizes.
Great, thank you. My last question is for Kansas City. So Mike and Julie, I'm just wondering if you would spend the last portion of this webinar maybe talking about what has helped you most about being part of this early learning community, maybe the top 2 reasons that you think this was a really great idea for you to be part of this network.
Mike, I'll start. So I will tell you, when I first started with the mayor's office, I immediately applied for NLC's Early Learning Nation technical assistance, and it helped me in so many ways. The main one was connecting me to other mayor's offices across the country that were also interested in early learning and wanting to learn how we can best harness the assets we do have as city leaders to help causes in early childhood. So it was really about us being servants to the community and knowing who are the players in your city and how to access them. It was through them that I learned about the Parent Leadership Training Institute. It was through them that I really learned how to really use the mayor's platform to leverage things like going after the pre-K campaign. So I was a junkie. I applied for 3 levels of technical assistance with them, and then had the pleasure, and so I was more than willing to be a focus group for them when this toolkit came around. But again, it just gives us language and discipline as a city to focus, because this is as you all know, school readiness is a huge issue We're so underfunded in this space. There's so much room to grow. We need to be disciplined and to feel like we're not lost. There's just so much work we want to do. And you all are already doing probably lots of great things. And so this, I think, first gives you an opportunity to celebrate what you already are doing. So looking at that tool and saying, oh yes, we are doing that. We could be a level 3 in this place, and really patting yourself on the back for that. And then giving you an area to say, okay, let's just focus on 2.4 or 3.5 or something like that, because we want to see progress. Particularly with your leadership, they like to see momentum. And seeing a city where you are already making success in areas makes it a lot easier to knock off some other ones. So I think it's just, I'm so thankful for NLC and NCCSP for creating this tool and giving it just a great roadmap to help us advance in our work in Kansas City.
That's great. Thank you, Julie.
Yeah, and I'll just add that it's everything Julie said, plus it helps to a community to identify what additional partners you want to bring to the table, because it is a pretty comprehensive action guide. And so, for example, bringing the people from housing or health to the table, this is a good way to show them how they fit into a larger initiative.
Great, thank you. Well, we're close to the end of our time, so let me take a moment to thank our presenters and our participants. Thank you, Cailin O'Connor, Anna White, Mike English, Julie Holland. Really appreciate you sharing your work, your insights, your experience, and the invitation to continue to work together. You'll see on the screen, this is a reminder for our upcoming webinars. Again, the next webinar on February 11th will use a different platform. So you could still go to the Zoom registration site, but just expect that you won't be on Zoom, you'll be on BigMarker. And in February, I'll be moderating, actually Alan Galitsky will be moderating the Science Supporting Dual Language Learners. Very excited about that webinar, and Becoming Big Bettable on February 25th. You'll start to see a lot of information for these as well, so put them on your calendar. As always, Tuesdays at 3 o'clock Eastern time. So let's see, I think that's it. If you haven't yet completed your poll, please do that before you go. Thank you to all of you for your participation, and look out for the email that you will get next Monday with a summary of today's webinar and the links to all the resources. On behalf of the Campaign for Grade Level Reading, thanks to all of you, and have a great week.
Thank
Bye.
you.